Bueno, buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas noches.
Hello, good afternoon, good day, good evening, everybody. According to the time zone that you are in, my name is Nicolas Kuitca, and I am the director for the Córdoba Music Biennial. For us, it's an honor to be closing the first edition of our biennial, which is done in the framework of the 100 years of the Music Union in Cordoba, the Musicians Union. It's an honor to be the local partners of this program from the British Council, Selectors Pro, and to be hosts for launching this program. Today, we will be on the panel of Urban Space and Music Today, New Spatial Configurations in Music. We are fortunate enough to have many different panelists invited from different parts of the world. Felipe Hoyos from Colombia, from the Ministry of Culture, Angharad from the UK, Juan, Murua, and Leonardo, Cagliero, from a project that was within the Córdoba Music Biennial, and Javier, Peña, Ibáñez from the Concentrico Festival. The dynamics that we will be using today in this panel. First of all, I'm going to introduce very briefly each one of the members of the panel. They're going to talk very briefly about the work that they have been doing, and then we're going to start reflecting on three themes that we have presented in order to have this discussion. These three themes are management and production of sound experiences in public space, also the importance of transdiscipline in order to achieve synergy with private and state institutions, artists, and design professionals, as well as civil society organizations. And in the third place, to debate about the possibility of looking into the post-COVID panorama in terms of scenes and concert halls, also the democratization of spaces for musical shows. These are the themes that we will be talking about. And now I will start introducing our panelists. First of all, I'm going to present Felipe Hoyos from Bogotá. He has studied political science with a master's in urban design from Spain. He works in the SAE from Colombia, or he's part of the SAE. He works in the implementation of public policy in urban and cultural issues, as well as the formulation and the follow-up of processes and information systems in terms of public space and cultural policy. Felipe has over 7 years of professional experience in cultural industry, and he also works in the Colombian Ministry of Culture as a coordinator of the team that is in charge of the law of implementation of public shows. It is a pleasure for us to have Felipe here with us today. We also have Angharad from the Center for Music Ecosystems of the UK. Angharad is consultant, instructor, and facilitator of arts in London and Paris, and she works with different sectors of the arts and culture to develop programs with the vision of future to facilitate change. This work includes the recently created Center for Music Ecosystems, a new NGO based on research and devoted to developing sustainable communities all over the world. We also have Javier Peña Ibáñez, who is director of Concentrico. Concentrico is an international festival which suggests to reflect on the urban space and the city. It invites to go through the city in connection between the different spaces, parks, and hidden spaces that sometimes are overlooked in our day-to-day lives. Also, Leonardo Cagliero, and who is director and coordinator of the Ciudad program. Leonardo is an industrial designer. He has a degree from the University of Córdoba. He is professor at the same university, and he is part of different research teams and research and development teams as well. And he's part of ELIPSAT. It's a space for art and subjectivities and health at the University of Córdoba. Juan Murua Palacio, he works also in issues related to public space and design. He is part of a architecture team. These are the introductions then, and now I'm going to give the floor to Felipe Hoyos from Bogota, so he can tell us about the work that he has been doing, that they have been doing. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to let you know that I'm very happy because I've never participated in a forum where they talk about the two things that I'm most interested about in life, which is the city and music. There are not many spaces where we approach these two topics, particularly in the public sphere where I work. Urban space as a container of the development of music scenes. This is a topic that always is necessary to study, even though there are developments from the private and the public sectors. The truth is that approaching this theme is always going to require new inputs and new reflections, because the topic really is endless. Arts have been developed more traditionally in a realm or in an environment that seems to be not necessarily involved in specific geographic spaces. And on the other hand, urban development, urban design, which is what particularly interests me the most, also seems to not contemplate the needs of development, the development needs that music scenes need or require. So I feel that these points of contact that of course exist and that each one of you in your cities identify, and of course these two topics, urban and cultural management, or particularly music, they will always need a space of encounter, a place to think about them together. As Nicolas introduced me before, I studied political science, and I always thought that I was going to work specifically on the city, and I have a master's degree from the University of Barcelona, which I finished in 2013. And when I came back to Colombia, I always thought I would be working on public space issues and issues related to the city, and I ended up working in a very recently created office that is implementing a very particular regulation in Colombia. This is the regulation that gives both legal and tax-related lines to public artistic manifestations such as circus, music, dance that take place in Colombia. From this office, we have a very broad understanding, a very broad vision in terms of consolidated structures and ephemeral spaces, and we started to look at what was going on in public space. We are not local administration, we are an organization that has national competence, but we do monitor what happens in the different public spaces in Colombia. I've also had a music seal, so I've worked in musical production. I know all the needs. A musical label. I used to have one. So I understand what goes on in the music scene and in terms of music production in my country. And I hope to continue my work as a concert producer in the future. And we have the topic of infrastructure. Where do these events take place, and how cities have the opportunity to develop this type of infrastructure, be it in public space or parks that, of course, are part of public space. I just want to say again that I'm very happy to be here in this forum today, and I hope that I am able to participate, giving my experience of what happens in Colombia and telling you about what happens here. So thank you again very much to the British Council, and thank you to my colleagues in Argentina as well. And of course, I am here to help about anything and all the discussions we will have in this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Felipe. I also extend that to other partners in the program from Colombia, Cuba, and the UK. For us, it is fantastic to be able to bridge gaps with other people around the world. So we're very thankful to the British Council. Now I will ask Angharad to tell us a bit about what she likes about her work and how she's been thinking from her institution about all of these issues. Angharad?
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So I'm a freelance consultant working in culture, but with a background more specifically in experimental music. And here today I'm representing the Centre for Music Ecosystems, which is a newly established global NGO, research-based NGO, where we're looking at, well, exactly how, I guess, the study of music ecosystems, how they fit together, and how a global policy can influence this in a kind of, I guess, a symbiotic process. How global policies can influence, well, there are no global policies, but national policies can influence music, and how music can, of course, feed back into the communities that it's a part of. So I'm thinking about what I can tell you. So our goal is to think about music ecosystems in order to develop more sustainable communities. So of course that can touch on many of the themes that we're due to speak about today, including public spaces, including COVID recovery, etc. So obviously in an ideal world, music would be incorporated into how we plan, develop and invest in all the places that we live and the lives of people who live there. And all cities, towns and places would recognise and invest in their own music ecosystem. But obviously we know that that doesn't tend to happen. In some places, music is entertainment. In others, it's primary or secondary benefits might be considered, but it's quite often not really incorporated into planning in a meaningful way. And something which is perhaps more particular to our work, but we do link everything we do with the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So always linking back to the most pressing issue of our time, which is obviously climate change, as we all know, and trying to do that with the kind of utmost urgency and collectivity that we can. So I could probably talk to you a little bit about what we mean when we say a music ecosystem, and we mean something which is multiplicitous and in constant evolution. So it could be the music industry itself, but it can be much more than that. Music education, city policies, it can be the technology sector, it could be sport, it could be really whatever. But the idea is that a healthy music ecosystem links and joins various differences. So some of it's obvious, like music labels or venues, and some of it not be obvious and might also sound completely banal, like good parking in the city for artists, or decent and transparent governance, for example. All of this is relevant and all of it links together. I might just tell you about the projects that we've done over the last year, which may resonate with some of the themes. There are three that I will touch on very briefly. The first simply something we've called the Sustainable Development Guide, which can be downloaded for free from the Centre for Music Systems website. And that links directly to each of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned. So I think, one of the goals, for example, is eradicating poverty in all everywhere. One of it's life on land, one is life underwater. So I'd recommend taking a look at that. There's also an exec summary, which is a bit easier to digest if you're short of time, as we all tend to be. The second project I'd like to just quickly mention is, again, a very direct connection with the UN. So the United Nations Development Programme. We have been working with working on case studies connected to intellectual property models and how change benefit not just of the creator, the community that the creator lives in as well. So intellectual property law is complex and rigid, and I guess we've been looking at different models using music as an influence about ways that things could potentially be different in lots of different settings. In that work, we spoke with around 10 missions around the world at length, interviews and focus groups. And in the end, we focused in on case studies in the Philippines, Kenya, and Bosnia. And based on that, we've produced a series of recommendations. At the moment, that's not publicly available, but it should be publicly available within the next month or so. So again, if that sounds interesting, that's something to perhaps have a look at our website. The third project, which is our third project as an organisation, coming up to a year of being formed, launches next month and is hopefully interesting, looking at sustainable touring models, well, more resilient music ecosystems in general, but in remote places in the world. So we'll be looking at Nuuk in Greenland, Anchorage in Alaska, and Tórshavn in the Faroe Islands, and thinking about how music ecosystems there operate at the moment and how they could operate in the future. And again, as you can imagine, obviously COVID recovery runs right through the heart of this, as it does through most work at the moment anyway. And equally also very much this idea of public space, for example. So yeah, there's hopefully a little taster into what we do and how it connects with some of today's themes.
Very interesting, Angharad. Thank you for sharing. I have a lot of questions that I will ask later. Now I'm going to give the floor to Javier so he can talk to us a bit about what they're up to. Thank you for the invite. From our experience in Spain, with an international perspective, we've always wanted to turn many of the activities that sometimes are done in inner spaces to the outdoors. So we use public spaces in the city in all of its typologies, parks, squares, streets, and understanding the fact that cities are places for debate and connection anywhere in the world. Since 2015, we hold a festival called Concentrico, which is a content platform, and we see how to establish flexible uses in cities for spaces that allow us to establish places for the community to gather and to imagine more cohesive futures among people who live in cities. I will now share my screen. Somebody needs to enable me. Can you tell me if I can share? In this dynamic, give me 1 second. This type of practice has, okay, I can see it now. Okay. In the end, the festival has tried to generate some spaces for daily use. This is the city of Logroño, 150,000 inhabitants in the region of La Rioja, the smallest one in Spain, which is very well known by its wines. Logroño is very small, but although the use of daily lives is on the street, we found that the public use space tends to be a consumption, private activity, and not experiences that invite to a harmonious living. So we established uses that link us to cultural aspects, political aspects, and musical aspects, such as the one we can see now, which was a work of art in the city of Logroño, and that then it has gone throughout Europe, Milano, and it has had workshops to do about collective use and playful use of public spaces, to have a commitment for the identity with regards to the monuments of a city, or in this case of Matteo Idogni, how the monuments and traditional architecture can be next to this coupole, which is here. It is what we call the city coupole. So next to tradition, you can set scenarios where to use music or different representations. We also have a debate about mobility there, and this is something where we have established different installations. One of the ones that have a lot to do with the idea of a stage, and something that was done also in the Bienal of Music in Cordoba. This piece, it's a project by FAR from Portugal, where in this square of San Bartolome, which has a trapezoid type shape, where we can see how the main side that gives to the left with a medieval front, they do a stage that is also a piece that combines and rescales the city for public space. In this case, you can see how it looks a bit like a stage, so allows us to play music, for example. So this is something that I wanted to show. Beautiful, Felipe, thank you. I also got something from Santiago, the co-director of the Music Biennale. He's so happy because his grandfather came from Logroño, so everything is connected. And for this last round of presentations, I'm going to let Leonardo is a director of the project Suena la ciudad, and also the coordinator for this project. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for Nico for his invite. Thank you for the British Council. This opportunity of showing what we've been doing for the first time in this first Biennale. I don't know whether you can share a screen. The project we're going to present is Suena la ciudad. It started in the first Bienal of Music in Cordoba. This project comes in line with one of the main objectives of articulating with the other worlds and other stakeholders, so that the Biennale is not just limited to the world of music, but also to articulate with many professions and dimensions in order to create interdisciplinary devices. Let's go one more. Within this framework, we thought of doing two workshops, one of the design of sound objects and one for design for designing stages. This first one, is to get the Bienal closer to society through design, through urbanism, and the object as a device to create a link with the society to open up activities that many times are carried out behind closed doors or in small groups. And we feel it is much more interesting for the city to live through the Biennale. Next, for this workshop, we propose the following: four-hour encounters to design the object, 2 constructive days of 8 hours to construct it, and because the teams were integrated by architecture and design firms, but also recent graduates. So there was a component for training which has to do with the experience, the interdisciplinary nature, and the need to relate academic world with tangible experiences to do with the professional development. We also had different advisors who spoke in a couple of occasions. Then these are some pictures of the day, which was symbolized by experimenting, by the confluence of different disciplines and the different perspectives, motivated dialogue, because they began thinking in terms of the new paradigms, to think about these events as opportunities to rethink public spaces and its uses, as Javier was saying. And these days were done in the architecture faculty of the city of Cordoba, and that's why there's also an institutional link that allowed us to go into spaces that are private or semi-public, and that also allowed us to build bridges. Next, this was the result of that first workshop. These are 4 sound objects: an electronic bench, 2 objects that have more to do with percussion, and another one that through a mechanism can generate a sound through the air. Next one. Next one, Juan. We saw the constructive day because we had this happening to work with material to relive or to inhabit a different space, in this case, the Museum of Industry in the city of Cordoba, which has also gave us the space for us to carry out the workshop. You can appreciate there the bench that was materialized. In this case, we worked with waste materials, and also with regards to what Angharad said about sustainable development, to think of these instances not only when it comes to the public spaces, but also for the materials used for these type of objects. Next one. In this one, we can see the other 2 objects which have been set up. This was about 10 days ago. We are putting the objects in their places now, so we still don't know exactly what the use has been or the appropriation of them by the public. We've had very nice comments, but we still don't have a more formal feedback, so we can conclude as to what this entailed for the city. Next one. And the second workshop, which has a bit more to do with what Felipe was speaking about, a bit more with the music and the city, has to do with a design workshop for scenes where we're thinking more with regards to COVID or post-pandemic. How did these kind of festivals be celebrated in the public space? What is the use for public space in this sense? And here, this is what we thought about, to go through a more significant interdisciplinarity, to rethink paradigms and to imagine or envision how these scenes could be set. And we have many disciplines collaborating. We have firms of architecture design, we have graduates, and we also have the members of a civil association called Juntas por el Derecho a la Ciudad, who approach urbanism in feminist terms. All of the teams were taken by members of this association, always thinking about the function, about I need a space for so many people, for so many cars. And the feminist view means to think about accessibility, safety, the diverse dimensions that exclude certain sectors of society, whether people who are disabled or women. This is much more significant because the projects were done with the constant help of sound people, lighting people, producers, stagehands, and people who work and research accessibility. And not only were they aiding these, but they were also giving some talks within this workshop.
We had 3 stages, a big one, a small one, and an intermediate one. In this photo, you can see what the day was like. There was a lot of interaction, a lot of experimentation. There was a lot of discussion and debate in relation to where we can take this. And here we can see the results of this workshop. This is what we reached. Different spaces that are very significant. A cloud in the center square of the city, a stage that generates kind of a diffuse perception in an enchanted island in the middle of a public park, and a series of totems that wanted to create the idea of a fair that was ultimately not designed. Next slide, please. And here we can see the results, how we materialize these ideas. We were surprised, apart from the fact that this was a big challenge because of the type of projects, in the results, we were able to see that there were many similarities to what the teams were mentioning or had projected. Here we can see that this is something that can be used during the day and during the night, and where the experience that is generated at both during daytime and nighttime is similar. This sort of cloud was hung from several feet from the floor, and during the day, it had a type of functionality that protected the artist and generated a kind of shade. And during the night, we had the LED tubes installed, and there was a different environment that was generated, much more eclectic, and also created this mixture of experiences for the different artists, as we can see here in the image. Next slide, please. In the case of the island, the same thing happened. This is a stage that was thought both for day and for night. And we have dissimilar experiences, but similar visual ones and environmental ones, the dialogue that is established with the surroundings, the way that this illusion is created with a reflection on the lake. And during the night, the lights are turned on, and we have a completely different scenographic experience. Next slide, please. And in the case of the totems, of which we don't have a big record because it was the last event that was done, and we are still editing and recovering all the material that we have been able to compile. But we have the possibility of generating an experience, a use of space that is differentiated. Situations that maybe here in Cordoba are not as frequent as in other parts of the world. In Latin America, and in particular, the city that we are in, the events, particularly public ones, are not as marked by design, architecture, and such a complex suggestion or proposal as we generated through the workshop. So the three different scenarios and the three stages, caused a lot of commotion in the city. There was a disruption of daily lives, there was a disruption of public space, and it enabled complying with our objective, our main aim, which was to link this event with the city, with the audience that can experiment this. Next slide, please, Juan. And in order to close, we have some conclusions that we were able to reach. These are maybe very preliminary or rushed conclusions because the festival has not, because we haven't finished yet. The festival took place during the last weekend. We still have to dismantle one of the objects. We have a lot of observation to do still, so we don't have general or definite conclusions. But here we can talk about the value of inter and transdiscipline to approach solutions to the problems that come from the context. Also, the need to build networks among the different social actors and institutions in order to transform paradigms. The idea of not working with very set in stone structures. When you have a city and you can see the city as a stage itself and benefiting from the event to highlight architecture in the city, but also institutions in the city, institutions that can foster culture, and also the importance of local knowledge, situated knowledge to face innovative projectual processes. So it's not about bringing standardized solutions to these very diverse realities, but it's about building local knowledge. I think that's the last slide. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Leo and Juan. That was very interesting. And now we're going to move on to the next part of our panel, where you will start discussing and debating between each other. I feel that there are many common topics that you've mentioned. I think it's very interesting that Felipe can monitor all the different public space, how from Concentrico, you also appropriate the city and they resignify it. I was very fascinated by what Angharad mentioned in relation to sustainability and remote systems. Our country, Argentina, which is such a big country, this is something that is important and it would be great to apply here in Argentina as well. So what happens with these experiences that have the public space as an interlocutor? I think this is a very complex topic, but I would like to ask you what you think are the challenges, the main challenges and strategies in order to carry this out. Whoever wants to start? Okay, I'm going to start. I believe that I'm the one who has the least experience among all of you. And what I consider that from the construction of public space itself, and this has to do with what I mentioned in my presentation, and particularly from the point of view of urban design, the relationship between how artistic activities, and particularly music activities, can find an answer or a coherence with urban design. What do I mean? There might be a good trend, and it might be very well received, to create streets that are only for people who are walking, not for cars. And this is a way of fostering the use of public space. The most natural thing that can happen here is that artistic activity will also attempt to be part of those exercises of configuration of public spaces. But the reality, and this is what happens in the latest urban developments in our cities, is that we don't even have places to connect. I mean connecting music equipment. And if I'm going to do an activity, if I'm going to do a cultural activity that can be even sponsored by the city governments themselves, when I open up this opportunity, which of something that might even generate an economic incentive in public space, these artists that are going to present there, they either they invade the sidewalk, and then we have a conflict between the people who are walking by, and so there starts to be a competition there. There starts to be a clash there. There are no guaranteed conditions. So it's very easy to see in Colombia, where our cities tend to the use of the bicycle. They do think about that, but our activities, the ones that we're talking about, that have to do with art and configuring spaces for that, that is not as clear. It might not even exist. So we have to start there. That's what I think, we have to start there. What does it mean to interact in public space from music? Sorry to interrupt you, but I was thinking about what Angharad mentioned of how music ecosystems are thought of. And if maybe an element that today is not taking into account has to do with the importance of urban space within this consideration of musical ecosystem, which will also impact in a way on how we think about the development of cities themselves. So I think that there is a really clear and interesting connection there between what you both are thinking. So you can have a city government with a local administration with a clear intention of fostering these type of activities in public space. But the reality is that when a musician comes into public space, he doesn't even have a place to connect his instruments to or his equipment to. And so the most important, the thing that will probably happen is that they will invade the space like a sidewalk, which is where we have pedestrians walking on. So there is not a lot of coincidence between those who design public space, so that we see ourselves represented in those spaces. That is my first reflection, so as to contribute to this discussion. Okay, Juan, I will ask you maybe if we can do very short interventions so we can all contribute. Go ahead, Juan. In relation to what Felipe was mentioning, and also with the work that he has been doing in relation to a regulation, to a new law about shows in different spaces, something that we have noticed when we were preparing this whole experience of the biennial is how the people who really understand the dynamics of public space are street artists, and how there's a dichotomy there where the state and state organisms don't want that to happen in public space. But these street artists bring a lot of nuance into the city. And sometimes there are guerrilla strategies so that they continue playing and continue performing in those in those spaces and looking for the gaps in legislation and regulation in order to continue performing. And we think this is really interesting, taking from these experiences. We want to value this know-how that all of these people have, people who are using the city on a daily basis, who know the public spaces, and this echo effect of the different spaces and their uses. We think this is very important. Also, Felipe, with one of the interventions that we had in one of the most important parks here, the audience went massively there, and they went in their bicycles, but the park did not have spaces for parking their bikes. And so several of the interventions became safe spaces for people to put their bicycles in. And so we think about these experiences as a laboratory to understand behavior of people in the cities and how they interact with the spaces, to see what happens with these spaces and with the people who inhabit them. Perfect, Juan. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else wants to add something. We have other topics also. All of this that we are talking about, we are living in a post-COVID context, and post, I'm going to place it between quotation marks because it's been very hard. I see it as a person that belongs to the music industry. I'm part of the musicians union, and it's been very hard, and we're still going through that process. We've been thinking about the different strategies and also the different scenes and scenarios in public space in order to carry out our activities in this post-COVID scene. Maybe one of the most important things that I perceive here are about two formats of music in public space. On the one hand, official programming that entails ticket purchasing and is a particular type of use of public space. And then we have maybe unregulated activities, on the other hand, activities that are much more spontaneous and that are not as regulated, and they don't have the same use conditions. I think that maybe when one uses public space, we also have to invite to these activities where there is not so much regulation, where there are spaces that can be used and that allow us to work with more freedom in how we meet in public spaces and how we are able to reach other people. From our experience in Concentrico, we really don't like when we have programmed activities, because we feel that that invitation to something happening more spontaneously enables a certain surprise and a certain interesting tension in relation to the use of the city, which we feel makes it even better. Yes, I share that view completely. Harry, is there anything that you want to add to these things that we have been talking about from the perspective of your own work?
I'm not sure necessarily, but I think what we would add is, I guess, maybe what's slightly different is looking at it all from a kind of global perspective, potentially. What could potentially be achieved if you were to add in, for example, global policies, thinking about all of the issues that we're talking about, which obviously don't exist, but yeah, thinking about local scales to national scales, and then thinking about being able to learn from each other from a global perspective is perhaps interesting.
Sí, me parece que cuando vos hablabas de las políticas.
Yes, when you were mentioning global policies, these moments of exchange are very important in order to think about territories and communities. In the notes that I took while each one of you were presenting, one of the topics that we thought about for discussing has to do with transdisciplinarity and how transdisciplinarity forces us to face other types of knowledge and other types also of global scenes. And I believe that that is our starting point to think about global strategies. I don't know if anybody wants to mention something in relation to those type of encounters, because I feel that all of the projects that you have mentioned work from this perspective, both trans and interdisciplinary.
Bueno, si quieres aquí nuevamente hacemos ahí como esto, pues nada, como que yo creo que ese reto de lograr sinergias
I think that this
pues eso sí lo debemos sufrir.
I think that this challenge, we are all facing it from our particular geographic regions. There are different aspects here. On the one hand, we have the artistic value of music, and on the other hand, we have the entertaining value of music. When we are working on the entertainment value, achieving synergies sometimes is facilitated with private entities so that they sponsor spaces. But when we talk about the artistic value of music in a certain environment or in public space, there we have some limitations, some more tangible limitations. It's not so easy to find resources or finance or ways of funding for some projects. Of course, there is some funding from the state, and at the end, that is the only thing that we have, because we don't have ticket sales. If it's in public space, we're not even going to sell tickets. We don't even have that element. So I think it's interesting to think about the funding of activities and this different synergy that is created or that we don't have or are not able to create, so that the ecosystem as such can work, can function. Thank you, Felipe. I am going to refer to some of the questions that have come up via the chat. These urban designs, some of the projects that you intervene, do they include the participation of spontaneous musicians? These spontaneous interpreters of music? I think I said yes. And we also try to foster this. We want them to do this. I believe that it is important to present or to create stages where people can present and represent music.
¿Algo más que alguien quiera agregar? Si no, también.
Is there anything else anybody would like to add? Or otherwise we're going to close, so to go to the second part of this meeting, which is an interactive talk among the speakers and the participants from each cohort, the ones selected from the UK, Argentina, Colombia, and Cuba, in order to have a more intimate meeting and talking about the particular projects. Does anybody want to say anything else? Yes, Nico. In some of the interventions at the Bienal, There wasn't appropriations with spontaneous artists when the stages were set because teams, with regards to the sound gear and the lighting gear, and speaking to some of these artists who were doing that, they were a bit intimidated by the formality of the situation, but they would play or sing when they were setting up. It wasn't completely consolidated on the stage, but the space was set for things to happen. When the cloud came up, before they installed the sound and the lighting system, many artists went through that and they acted and performed spontaneously for a non-existent audience. But when everything was installed and set up, we asked people to come and perform, and they said that because things were a bit more formal with all of the gear that you've got in a show, that intimidated them and they didn't feel as comfortable. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Juan. Now we're going to go to the private session with the different cohort teams. So thank you for people who are watching on YouTube. Angharad, Felipe, Leo, Juan, and Javier. Thank you for participating in this public selection. And now we're going to go to the second part of this Selector Pro program. Thank you.